Stop watching your manifestation. Every time you check on it, you are sending one of the most destructive signals a human nervous system can generate. Every time you look for signs that money is approaching, every time you scan the bank account for evidence that something has shifted, every time you monitor the 3D for proof that your inner work is producing results, you are telling your subconscious something it accepts without argument and encodes without hesitation. The thing is not here yet. You do not have it. The search continues. And a nervous system running a search does not run the state of having. It runs the state of seeking. And seeking is the opposite of the state that produces manifestation. This is why most people who study Neville Goddard for years see limited results. Not because the law does not work, not because their technique is wrong, because they are watching. And watching is the activity of someone who does not yet believe. The reason nobody in the spiritual industry will tell you this clearly is that watching feels like dedication. It feels like staying connected to the goal. It feels like the responsible, committed thing to do. Every sign you look for feels like participation in the process. Every synchronicity you track feels like evidence of alignment. But from the perspective of your nervous system, every single one of those behaviors carries an identical message. I do not yet have the thing I am watching for. And your subconscious is not evaluating the spiritual intention behind the behavior. It is reading the behavior. And the behavior of watching is the behavior of not having. So it produces more not having, mechanically, without judgment, with the same neutrality and accuracy with which it produces everything else in your experience. Neville Goddard described the state that precedes physical manifestation in a way that most people read and understand intellectually, without ever grasping what he was actually pointing at. He talked about the Sabbath, he talked about entering into rest, he talked about the work being finished, the impression having been made, and the consciousness simply inhabiting the fulfilled state without checking on it or managing it or watching it. He used biblical language because that was the language available to him. But what he was describing was a very specific neurological condition that modern neuroscience can describe in precise mechanistic terms. It is the condition of a nervous system that has accepted the desired reality as already real and therefore has no remaining need to monitor whether it is real. It is the condition of a person who already has the thing, and the single most reliable marker of that condition, the thing that distinguishes it from every form of hoping and wishing and trying and waiting, is indifference to the timing of the physical arrival. This word indifference is misunderstood almost universally in the context of manifestation. People hear indifference and they think it means not caring. They think it means detachment in the sense of resignation, giving up, deciding the thing does not matter. That is not what Neville was pointing at. That is not what the nervous system produces when it genuinely accepts a reality as done. What it produces is something much more specific. It is the absence of the monitoring impulse, the absence of the checking reflex, the absence of the low-grade, constant background activation that characterizes the nervous system of someone waiting for something uncertain to happen. Think about the things in your life that you genuinely have and have had for a long time. You do not check on them. You do not scan the environment for signs that they continue to exist. You do not practice gratitude for them multiple times a day in an attempt to maintain their presence. They are simply there, and your nervous system registers them as simply there, and the monitoring impulse never fires because there is nothing uncertain about them. That is the state. That is what Neville called rest. And that state applied to money is what makes the physical arrival of money not a miracle, but an inevitability. Most practitioners of Neville's work have inverted the entire process. They have turned the monitoring impulse into a spiritual practice. They call it gratitude work. They call it sign recognition. They call it staying aware of the ways the law is moving in their lives. And all of those things, however they are framed, are the behavior of someone who is not certain. They are the behavior of someone who needs confirmation. Someone who is still at the fundamental level of their nervous system, operating from the outside of the desired reality rather than the inside of it. The person who already has the money does not need to practice gratitude for it. They do not need to look for signs that it is coming. They do not need to monitor their alignment and make sure they are vibrating correctly. These practices feel spiritual. They feel like dedication and commitment to the work, but they are indistinguishable from the perspective of your nervous system from waiting. They are waiting dressed in the language of faith. The activation mechanism Neville was describing, the thing that actually tips the nervous system from the state of wanting into the state of having, is not a more intense practice. It is not a longer SATS session, or a more emotionally charged affirmation, or a more precise scene imagined in more vivid detail. It is a genuine shift in relationship to the physical evidence. It is the moment when the inner state becomes so primary, so real, so structurally solid as the ground truth of your experience, that the outer evidence loses its authority. Not because you have decided to ignore it, but because your nervous system has simply stopped treating it as the measure of what is true. The bank account becomes information rather than verdict. The absence becomes temporary data rather than permanent fact. And in that shift, the monitoring impulse drops. Not because you forced it to drop, because there is nothing left to monitor. The question has been answered at a level deeper than the physical, and the nervous system recognizes that. Here is why this is so difficult for most people to access, and why it remains the most undertaught and most misrepresented piece of Neville's work. Genuine indifference to the timing of the physical arrival is not something you can perform. It is not something you can practice your way into through effort and intention. The nervous system knows the difference between genuine acceptance of a reality and the performance of acceptance. It knows the difference between a person who truly does not need the bank account to confirm the inner state, and a person who has decided to act as though they do not need it, while internally continuing to monitor it closely. The performance produces nothing. Sometimes it produces the opposite of the intended result, because the effort required to maintain the performance is itself a signal of inner conflict, a signal that the assumption has not yet been genuinely made. What produces genuine indifference is what Neville described as living in the end, not visiting the end during a practice session, living there, making the imagined state the habitual residence of your consciousness rather than the occasional destination of a deliberate technique. When you live in the end, the physical world is no longer your primary source of information about your reality. The inner state is. And when the inner state is sufficiently solid and sufficiently consistent and sufficiently real at the level of actual felt experience, the impulse to monitor the outer state for confirmation simply does not arise. Not because you suppressed it, because the question it was designed to answer has already been answered from the inside. Neville talked about this repeatedly in ways that students often read past because the language seems simple. He said the imagining creates the reality. He said assume and it will harden into fact. He said the scene implying fulfillment, imagined with enough feeling and enough repetition to become the habitual dwelling of consciousness, must appear in the physical. He was not describing a process you watch from the outside. He was describing a process you participate in from the inside. And participation from the inside means that the inner state is always the reference point. The outer is always the echo. You do not check on the echo. You do not monitor whether the echo has caught up. You inhabit the original sound, and you let the echo happen on its own timeline without needing to confirm that it is happening. The specific failure mode that keeps the most serious and most committed practitioners stuck is this. They use the practices to access the inner state for a defined period each day, and then they return to monitoring the outer state for the remaining time. And the monitoring undoes the work of the practice, not because monitoring is some powerful negative force that cancels out positive visualization, but because monitoring is the behavior of a specific type of consciousness. It is the behavior of someone who has not accepted the inner state as the primary reality. And consciousness is always expressing the state it inhabits, not the state it visits. If you visit the state of having during your practice and inhabit the state of monitoring during the rest of your day, your consciousness is a monitoring consciousness. And a monitoring consciousness will manifest more of what monitoring implies. More waiting, more checking, more absence. This is what Neville meant when he said you must persist in the assumption, not persist in the practice, persist in the assumption. The assumption has to become the background. It has to become the lens through which you experience the entire day, not just the 20 minutes you dedicate to deliberate work. And the signal that the assumption has become the background is exactly what we are describing here. The monitoring impulse drops. The checking reflex quiets. The scanning of the environment for evidence of approach slows and eventually stops. Not because you forced these things to stop, because the nervous system, running from a sufficiently solid assumption, simply has no use for them anymore. There is nothing to monitor, there is nothing to confirm. The thing is real. It is done. The physical is in the process of expressing what consciousness has already decided, and the appropriate response to that process is not vigilance, it is rest. Before we go further, check the pinned comment below this video. What is there is directly relevant to what we are building toward in the second half, and it will give you a concrete starting point for the shift we are describing. The reason clinical indifference is so hard to manufacture deliberately is that most people mistake it for a decision rather than a result. They hear the instruction to stop monitoring, and they try to stop monitoring through an act of will. They tell themselves not to check the bank account. They avoid thinking about money. They practice what they call detachment and describe to themselves as trusting the universe. And within hours, sometimes within minutes, the monitoring impulse returns because it was never addressed at the level where it actually lives. The monitoring impulse is not a conscious habit. It is a neurological response generated by a nervous system that is operating from a state of uncertainty, and you cannot suppress a neurological response through conscious decision. You can only eliminate it by removing the condition that generates it. The condition that generates the monitoring impulse is the absence of genuine acceptance of the inner state as real, and that absence cannot be resolved by trying not to monitor. It can only be resolved by actually accepting the inner state as real at the neurological level, by building the assumption so deeply and so completely into the architecture of your nervous system that the monitoring impulse no longer has a trigger. Think about what Neville actually described when he talked about people who manifested rapidly and consistently. He did not describe people who were disciplined about not checking on their manifestations. He described people whose consciousness was so completely occupied by the imagined state that the question of whether it had arrived physically never really occurred to them as an open question. They were not suppressing the monitoring impulse. They were not white-knuckling their way through the urge to check on the situation. The question simply did not arise for them with the same urgency that it arises for someone who has not genuinely assumed, because for them, the inner certainty was sufficient. The inner state was the reference point, and from inside that state, the outer evidence was just the 3D doing what the 3D always does, catching up. This is the distinction that separates the people who get results from the people who have studied Neville for years and remain frustrated. It is not a difference in knowledge. It is not a difference in technique or practice or dedication. It is a difference in the depth of the assumption. The people who get results have made the assumption so deeply that monitoring the outer evidence feels, to their nervous system, unnecessary, redundant, like checking to see if your name is still your name. The people who remain stuck have made the assumption at the level of conscious intention while the nervous system is still running the old program underneath, still checking, still uncertain, still treating the outer evidence as the verdict on whether the inner state is real. And consciousness is always expressing the actual operating state of the nervous system, not the intended state of the conscious mind. Neville described the relationship between the imaginal act and the physical result using a very precise metaphor. He said, "The vine and the branches, the imaginal state is the vine. The physical circumstances are the branches. The branches do not produce the vine. The vine produces the branches." This is the exact inversion of the relationship that monitoring assumes. Monitoring treats the physical circumstances as the vine, the thing that determines whether the inner state is justified. It treats the bank account as the source of information about whether the manifestation is working. But Neville was explicit. The imaginal is the vine. The physical is always and only the branch, and you do not check on the vine by examining the branches. You tend to the vine directly. You inhabit the inner state, you live from it, you let it be the source, and the branches, the physical circumstances, will express it, not because you watched them carefully enough, because the vine is healthy, because the inner state is real, because the assumption is solid and the 3D has never done anything other than express whatever the inner state dictates. The 3D is not slow. It is not unreliable. It is not withholding. It is expressing exactly what the dominant inner state dictates, with the precision of a mirror and the accuracy of a law. The only question is whether the inner state you are broadcasting most consistently is the state of having or the state of monitoring for what you do not yet have, because one of those states produces the physical, the other produces the absence of it. And only one of them is characterized by genuine indifference to the timing. Only one of them feels from the inside, like rest. So how do you build genuine indifference rather than performed indifference? Because this is the question that the explanation always arrives at, and it is the question that most teachers answer inadequately. They say things like release attachment or surrender to the universe, or let go of the outcome, and those phrases point in the right direction while completely failing to describe an actionable mechanism. Genuine indifference is not something you choose the way you choose to take a different route to work. It is something that results from a specific change in the neurological ground state. It is the byproduct of a consciousness that has actually genuinely, at the level of felt experience, rather than intellectual intention, accepted the desired reality as already real. And the only path to that acceptance runs through exactly what Neville described: sustained imagination of the fulfilled state, not visualization as a technique you perform and then step out of, imagination as the primary activity of consciousness, the habitual lens through which experience is filtered. What this means practically is that the work is not to stop monitoring. The work is to build the inner state until monitoring becomes unnecessary. You do not fight the urge to check the bank account. You build the inner architecture until the urge no longer has sufficient charge to arise. You do not practice detachment. You practice assumption until assumption becomes so embedded in the neural fabric that the alternative, the monitoring, the checking, the scanning for evidence feels foreign and unnecessary. This is not quick work. Neville was honest about that. He said it requires persistence. He did not mean persistence in the sense of doing the same technique repetitively for a long time. He meant persistence in the sense of inhabiting the assumed state continuously enough and with enough emotional consistency that it eventually becomes the ground state, the default, the thing that runs in the background when you are not actively thinking about manifestation at all. There is a specific moment that many people who have genuinely applied Neville's work describe, though they describe it in different language. It is the moment when the concern drops, not the moment when they decided to stop being concerned, the moment when the concern simply was not there, when they noticed midday that they had not thought about the manifestation for hours, not because they were suppressing it, because the inner state was sufficiently settled that the question of whether the physical had arrived was simply not generating the same urgency it previously had. That moment is not the result of willpower or spiritual discipline. It is the result of a nervous system that has genuinely shifted its ground state. And it is recognizable when it happens, because it does not feel like achievement. It feels like relief. It feels like the quiet that follows the end of a sound you did not realize was always there. Neville described this moment in the language of the Sabbath, the seventh day, the day of rest after the creative work is complete. He was not speaking poetically. He was describing an observable, specific condition of consciousness that he had watched in himself and in the people he worked with over decades. It is the condition of a consciousness that has done the work of imagining and has accepted the result of that work as real and is now simply resting in that acceptance, not monitoring it, not managing it, not checking on it, resting. And in that rest, the physical world does what it has always done. It expresses the consciousness that is doing the resting. The people who manifest money consistently, the ones who seem to operate with an ease and a naturalness around financial abundance that looks to most people like luck or advantage, share one neurological characteristic that is almost never discussed. They are not working at it. They are not maintaining their alignment through vigilance and practice and daily monitoring of their vibration. Their nervous system's relationship to money is settled. It is not an active project. It is background. It is assumed. And from that state of settled assumption, the external conditions simply organize themselves around the inner architecture the way water finds its level. Not dramatically, not through the specific mechanism of a single big event or a single turning point, through 1,000 small movements of probability and perception and behavior that all point in the same direction, because the inner state pointing them there has become the dominant signal. This is available to you. It is not reserved for people with a specific spiritual background or a particular level of practice or some innate capacity that you might or might not possess. It is the natural result of doing what Neville actually described, rather than what most teachers say he described. It is the result of making the imagined state the actual habitual dwelling of your consciousness rather than the occasional destination of a deliberate session. It is the result of treating the inner as real and the outer as the echo, consistently enough and for long enough that the nervous system stops treating the outer as the measure of whether the inner is justified. And it is the result of building, through real practice and real repetition and real emotional engagement, an inner architecture that is more structurally solid than the evidence the physical world presents against it. Stop monitoring whether the money is coming. Not because monitoring is spiritually incorrect, because monitoring is the activity of a consciousness that has not yet accepted the inner state as real, and the law does not respond to what you intend. It responds to what your consciousness most consistently inhabits. If you want the law to deliver the result, give it the consciousness of someone who already has the result. Give it the stillness, the quiet, the indifference to timing that is not resignation but completion, the state of a person for whom the question has already been answered at a level deeper than the physical world can reach. Neville said it over and over, in every way he could find to say it. The imaginal is the real. Everything else is the echo. Stop watching the echo and inhabit the sound. There is one more thing that needs to be said here, because it is the piece that trips up even the most serious practitioners. Genuine indifference to the physical timing does not mean indifference to the desired outcome itself. It does not mean you have stopped wanting the financial change or decided you do not need it. It means the wanting has been replaced by having at the neurological level. The desire does not disappear. It completes. It becomes satisfaction rather than longing. It becomes the quiet fullness of a state that has already arrived in consciousness rather than the active yearning of a state that has not. And that distinction, wanting versus having, longing versus satisfaction, is the entire difference between a consciousness that manifests and a consciousness that continues to generate the conditions for wanting. Neville did not teach you to stop wanting things. He taught you to want things in the specific way that produces them, by having them in imagination first, by making the having so real in the inner architecture that the wanting transforms into the satisfaction of already owning the thing. And from that satisfaction, the physical has no option but to follow. The indifference is not the goal. The indifference is the symptom. It is the sign that the assumption has genuinely been made. It is the nervous system signaling, through the absence of the monitoring impulse, that it has accepted the new ground state. When you feel it, when you notice that the urgency around the financial situation has genuinely quieted rather than been suppressed, that is Neville's Sabbath. That is rest. That is the point at which the physical world begins to catch up to what consciousness has already decided. Not because you stopped caring, because you stopped needing to check. If any of this shifted something in how you understand why your manifestation has been feeling effortful rather than inevitable, leave a comment below and be specific. Tell me what changed. The people watching this, who are still in the monitoring state, still checking daily, still scanning for signs, they learn most from the comments where someone describes exactly where the click happened for them. That specificity is what breaks the pattern for someone else. And if you know someone who is working hard at Neville's teachings and still frustrated, share this with them. Not because effort is wrong, because there is a specific kind of effort that produces the result and a specific kind that prevents it. And the difference between those two things is exactly what we just described. There is a practical dimension to everything we have described that is worth examining closely, because the abstract principle becomes most useful when you can recognize it in the specific texture of your actual daily experience. Genuine indifference to timing shows up in very concrete ways. It shows up in how you respond when someone asks you about your financial situation. The person who is monitoring their manifestation will feel a specific tightening when the question arises, a small contraction, a rapid internal scan of the current state followed by a gap between the current state and the desired state. That gap is the monitoring impulse expressing itself in real time. The person who has genuinely assumed will feel something different, not necessarily joy or enthusiasm, more like neutrality. Like the question has a straightforward answer that does not require the assessment of a gap. Because the inner state does not have a gap, it is already at the destination. Genuine indifference also shows up in decisions. The person operating from the monitoring state makes decisions about money from the perspective of the current bank account. every financial decision is filtered through the current evidence. The current evidence says there is not enough. So decisions get made from not enough. They get shaped by the consciousness of lack, even when the person is simultaneously practicing Neville's techniques and believing they are operating from abundance. Because decisions are made at the speed of the nervous system, not the speed of conscious intention. The nervous system makes the call before the conscious mind can intervene with its intended abundant state. And the nervous system is running the dominant ground state, which is the monitoring state, which is the state that treats the current bank account as the truth. The person who is genuinely assumed makes decisions from a different internal reference point, not necessarily decisions that defy financial reality, but decisions that are not shaped by the contraction of lack. Decisions made from a nervous system that treats abundance as the ground state rather than the hoped-for future state. This is one of the most reliable indicators that the assumption has or has not been genuinely made, not what you think when you are deliberately thinking about manifestation, what you do automatically when money is the context. The automatic responses tell you what the nervous system actually believes. And if the automatic responses are characterized by contraction, by monitoring, by treating the current external state as the authoritative measure of your reality, then the assumption has not yet been made at the level where it would change the ground state. And no amount of deliberate practice will produce physical results until that ground state actually shifts. Neville described the process of shifting the ground state with a consistency that is almost obsessive across his body of work. He returned to it in lecture after lecture because he understood it was the thing most people were not getting. He said the secret is feeling, not thinking, not intending feeling. The feeling of already having, sustained as the habitual state of consciousness, is what shifts the ground state, not the idea of having. The feeling. And the feeling he was pointing at is not a manufactured emotion. It is the specific emotional tone of a nervous system that has accepted something as real. The tone of completion rather than anticipation. The tone of already rather than soon. The tone of rest rather than effort. And that tone is not something you produce by trying to feel it. It is something that arises as a natural consequence of spending enough time actually inside the imaginal state that the nervous system begins to accept it as the primary reality. This is why Neville placed such emphasis on SATs, on the state akin to sleep, on using the hypnagogic threshold as the delivery mechanism for the new assumption. It is not because the hypnagogic state is mystically powerful in itself. It is because the hypnagogic state is the point at which the critical filter of the conscious mind is at its lowest activity. It is the window in which new impressions can reach the subconscious with the least resistance. And the subconscious, once it accepts a new impression as real, begins generating the feeling of that reality automatically, not when you are deliberately practicing, all the time, in the background, as the new ground state. And when the subconscious is generating the feeling of already having the money as a background state, the monitoring impulse begins to weaken, because the subconscious is no longer broadcasting uncertainty, it is broadcasting completion, and you do not monitor what is already complete. The path from where most people are to where Neville was pointing is not a path of more effort or better technique or deeper faith in the abstract. It is a path of consistent, persistent, emotionally real inhabitation of the inner state until the inner state becomes more real to the nervous system than the outer evidence, until the assumption becomes the ground, until the monitoring drops not because you silenced it, but because it no longer has a sufficient trigger to fire, until the indifference is not performed but simply present. The natural condition of a consciousness that has done the creative work and entered into rest, and from that rest, from that genuine, neurologically real, non-performed indifference to the timing of the physical arrival, the law does exactly what Neville said it would do. It externalizes the consciousness. It brings the physical into alignment with the inner state, not because you watched carefully enough to make it happen, because you finally stopped watching and let it happen. The only question left is whether you are ready to stop calling the monitoring spiritual and start recognizing it for what it is, the evidence of a nervous system that has not yet made the assumption. The evidence of a consciousness still living from the outside of the desired reality, still treating the outer world as the source of truth about the inner state, still waiting for the physical to confirm what can only ever be established internally. The moment you genuinely stop monitoring is not the moment of giving up. It is the moment of completion, the moment the creative work is done and the rest has begun. That is the Sabbath Neville described. That is the state from which all of his teachings were designed to operate. And that is the state that, once genuinely inhabited, makes manifestation not an effort, but an inevitability.